Okay, we finally got around to doing a another version of our LDAP Spring example. So let's take a look at that. I think in the last video I mentioned I would do something on paging, so I finally whipped something together using Spring as opposed to the old flavor, and I actually came up with a couple of different ways to handle it. And so we're going to go back to our Spring config. In the previous videos we had two different configs. We had one for a Apache DS LDAP server, and we had another one for a Microsoft Atom server running on my Windows box. So what we did was we came up basically with this little interface called the LDAP helper events, and it's a paging event that will get called as if it was a callback sorta, and you'll get notified of this whenever a paging event occurs, whenever another row of pages or records are pulled in based on the page number that you specify, page size. So we also have a separate class now for just doing the paging, and I called that appropriately LDAP page results. So you see we set up some properties that we're going to have to set up in order to do it. We're going to need a group search, a user search, and then of course this is our helper event object that we're going to be calling back into. We're going to need a base of our LDAP server where we're going to start looking. We have an LDAP template, that's our Spring template. So in a sense a lot of these variables we're already using in the DAO that we created before. So we have a couple of different methods here. We have a find all method that we're going to be running when we're treating this as a Spring bean. We're going to use this for doing both the group and the user searches, and see here we're going to have to track our own cookie because we're going to have to pass that back in. The cookie basically allows the pager to keep track of where you left off in the directory. So when you do a read you'll get back say 10 records in a page, and then you'll get a cookie back telling him where he left off, and then the next time you do the read you pass the cookie in and that's how Spring knows where it left off. And actually that's how it works too in the old-fashioned way using the JavaX stuff. So when we're using our interface to do the callback we have two different methods. We have a find all users and a find all groups, and you see here when we're setting up our attribute mapper, and this is similar to, well, not similar, it's exactly the same as what we did in our DAO, where we have that attribute mapper and we're calling into that. In this case we're getting a list of them now, whereas before we were just getting a list of UIDs, and then for each one reading a record from the server and populating the model with the attributes from the LDAP server, whereas in this case we're getting back a paginated list of those models here. So, and then what we do is we set up a handler for our attributes, and then we set up our results directory context processor, and then we set up our cookie, and then we start iterating through the search results here. That's what we're doing, and every time we get a list of results we're calling back into our page event and sending it the list, and then we keep doing that until our cookie is null. Once we get a null cookie we don't have any more results. So you see the first time we come into this we're passing a null value for the cookie, and that's how the paginator knows it's the first time through, and then we just keep iterating through that until we get a null back from our cookie, and then we're done. And we're doing exactly the same thing here, except the difference is we're using the group search that we're setting up rather than the user search. Okay, so here these two different methods are coded to use the values of our properties, whereas the first one we're passing the filter in and doing it on the fly. So let's see if there's anything else here to go over. The one thing is with our contact attribute mapper. In the last video I happened to mention that whenever you do it like this you could get a null pointer exception, because here we're assuming that the attribute is there. Actually it's like this. So we're assuming the attribute's there. We're doing the get right off the bat. And in the case of a CN we're probably okay. I don't think there's an LDAP server around that doesn't have a CN attribute. So, but however I mentioned that we didn't have a UID attribute in some, And that's certainly the case when you're getting a group record. So since we're reusing this mapper for both our users and our groups when doing the paging, of course the first time I ran it I did get the null pointer exception, so I had to change the code so that it checks to see if I have an attribute for a UID, and then if I do, then I get the value, otherwise we don't add it to our model. Okay, so go back and look at our pager. Okay, so we have an LDAP pager, and we have two different ways we're going to run it. One way is to run these two methods individually. The other way is to treat this basically as a spring bean and run the find all method. When we're running them individually, we created a separate spring bean that's going to hold our properties, and then these properties are going to get passed in to the pager. And let's take a look at our properties here. So here's our paging attributes. You see we're setting these same values, and then when we run the actual page results class as a spring bean in and of itself, we can pass in the values for that directly rather than doing it indirectly like we're doing here. So if we go look at our test program that's running this, which by the way we've added log4j logging now, we're not using sysout_println for this one. In a minute I'll go over all the libraries that are being used here. I think I forgot to go over that in the first couple of videos. So again, we have the two separate config files for our two different Spring configs for our two different LDAP servers. In this case we're going to point to the Microsoft one first. We're going to get our factory, we're going to create a new instance of ourselves, and then we're going to run the two methods individually using the event. So you see our class implements that event interface, and here's the event here where we're calling back in and passing in the list of objects we get back from the paginated results. And then we're going to go iterate through that list and print each one of them out, okay, using a log4j logging. And then once we print them out using the event interface, then what we're going to do is run the same thing again, except this time we're going to get a spring bean pager that already has the attributes filled in. Again, let me show you here. See, here we're getting our paging attributes and then getting the attributes from that and then populating our object with those values. And then here what we're doing is we're getting the spring bean, and Spring has already populated that for us, that instance. So and that's how we're going to run it here. And in this case we're going to call the find all method, but we're going to pass it in the user search that we set in, and then here we're passing in the group search that we set in. Okay, and then running based using one method from the spring bean